The boy didn't speak much anymore. It wasn't that he didn't know how. It was that words, for all their noise, hadn't saved anything that mattered. Not his family's laughter, not the lightness in his mother's eyes, not the man who used to be his father, before life bent him into someone else. So Ethan Carter, 10 years old, small for his age, with solemn gray eyes too old for his round face, chose silence. He wore it like a second skin. It was a rainy, gray afternoon when Sarah Carter gently coaxed him into the battered old station wagon. Neither spoke much during the drive. The windshield wipers thudded rhythmically against the glass, a steady beat trying to fill the emptiness between them. Sarah glanced at her son. His hoodie was pulled up, almost hiding the soft, dark hair that curled around his ears. His hands, small, pale, clenched and unclenched in his lap. Please let today be different, she thought, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. The Willow Creek Animal Shelter sat on the edge of town, surrounded by weedy lots and rusting fences. It wasn't a cheerful place, but Sarah had heard, sometimes, if you were lucky, you could find a new kind of beginning there, and they needed a beginning. God, did they need one? As they pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot, Sarah turned off the engine and looked at her son. "You don't have to, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice rough with emotion. "Only if you want to." Ethan shrugged, eyes downcast. But after a moment, he reached for the door handle. That was enough. They stepped inside, the heavy door creaking on its hinges. The smell hit Ethan first, a strange mix of bleach, wet fur, and something sadder he couldn't name. Rows of cages lined the walls, each holding a life inside. Some of the dogs barked frantically at the newcomers. Some whined pitifully. Some just stared, silent and exhausted. A volunteer, a woman with silver hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun, approached with a tired but genuine smile. "Hi there, first time here?" she asked warmly. Sarah nodded, smoothing down her jacket nervously. "This is Ethan," she said, resting a hand on her son's shoulder. "We're hoping to meet someone special." The woman's eyes softened. "Well, Ethan," she said, kneeling to his level, "sometimes it's not about choosing. Sometimes it's about being chosen." Ethan said nothing. He simply nodded once. The woman, her name tag read Maggie, stood and gestured for them to follow. They moved down the aisles slowly. Ethan's shoes squeaked slightly on the linoleum. Everywhere around him were pleading eyes, wagging tails, paws scrabbling against metal bars. It was overwhelming. He paused at a cage where a young Labrador mix threw himself against the bars, yipping excitedly. Ethan smiled faintly, but shook his head. Too much noise. Too much need. They kept walking. Another cage held a huddle of tiny black and white puppies, tangled together like a pile of socks. They were cute. Adorable even. But Ethan's heart stayed quiet. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. He only knew he hadn't found it yet. About halfway down the third aisle, just as he was starting to feel the creeping weight of disappointment, he saw him. At first glance, the puppy seemed almost ordinary. Smallish, golden fur, a little darker around the ears, floppy paws too big for his body, a tail that thumped slowly, once against the floor. But it was the eyes that stopped. Ethan cold. Unlike the others, this puppy didn't bark, didn't jump or whine. He simply sat quietly in the middle of his kennel, watching Ethan approach with a gaze that was both impossibly old and unbearably soft. Ethan knelt without thinking, resting his fingers lightly against the cold wire. The puppy stood, stretched his gangly legs, and padded forward. He pressed his damp nose against Ethan's fingers with the gentlest pressure, not demanding, not desperate, just there. Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly. Something inside him, something small and battered and hopeful, stirred. Sarah crouched beside him, peering into the cage. "You like him?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the puppies. Maggie smiled, a little knowingly. "That's Max," she said. "He's a bit different from the others." "How?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Maggie shrugged. He's calm, patient, doesn't push. He just waits, like he knows the right person will come. Ethan blinked hard against the sudden burn in his eyes. He looked back at Max. The puppy tilted his head slightly, as if listening. Ethan felt the connection settle around him like a warm blanket. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It just was. Can I hold him?" he asked, surprising himself. Maggie's smile widened. Of course. She unlocked the cage carefully, murmuring softly to Max. The puppy stepped out with careful, deliberate movements, not the frantic scrambling Ethan had seen from the others. Maggie scooped him up and placed him gently into Ethan's arms. The boy sat back on his heels, cradling the small, warm body against his chest. Max wriggled for a moment, finding a comfortable spot. Then he sighed. A deep, contented little huff, and rested his head against Ethan's heart. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking rapidly. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the steady thump of Max's heartbeat against his ribs. It matched his own. "He's mine," Ethan said quietly, firmly. "I can feel it." Sarah knelt beside him, her own heart breaking and healing all at once. "Yes, baby," she said thickly. "He's yours." The adoption took time, forms to fill, questions to answer. A waiting period, usually mandatory, waved after one look at Ethan's face. Maggie handed them a leash and a small bag of food. "He's a good boy," she said, as she crouched to ruffle Max's ears. "Take care of each other." Ethan nodded solemnly. "We will." He held Max tightly all the way to the car, refusing to let go even when Sarah offered to buckle him in. "I'll hold him," Ethan insisted, wrapping his arms securely around the puppy. Sarah smiled and didn't argue. As they drove home, Ethan leaned his cheek against Max's fur, breathing deeply. He smelled of soap and sawdust and something sweetly, stubbornly alive. At home, everything felt different. The house was still small and drafty. The living room still bore the scars of old arguments, a dent in the wall, a coffee table with a cracked leg. But now there was a new sound. The soft click of Max's paws against the floor, the gentle jingle of his collar, the low, rhythmic breathing as he dozed beside Ethan on the threadbare couch. Sarah watched them from the kitchen doorway, hands curled around a chipped mug of tea. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe, just a little, that things might get better. Later that night, after dinner, a hasty meal of grilled cheese and canned soup, Ethan climbed the stairs slowly, Max following faithfully. In his small bedroom, Ethan hesitated by the bed. Max sat at his feet, looking up expectantly. "You can sleep with me," Ethan said shyly, patting the blanket. Max needed no second invitation. He scrambled up, turned around twice, and collapsed in a golden heap against Ethan's side. The boy laughed softly, a sound so rare it startled Ethan. He stretched out, one hand resting lightly on Max's warm back. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere downstairs, a door slammed, sharp, angry. Ethan flinched instinctively, curling inward. Max lifted his head, ears pricking. He crawled up Ethan's chest and laid down carefully, his small weight pressing gently against the boy's ribs. Ethan buried his face in the puppy's fur. "I'm not scared," he whispered. "Not anymore." Max wagged his tail once softly, then settled in closer. Together they breathed in the dark. Together they waited for morning. The bond was already sealed. Neither knew it yet, but from that moment on, there would be no Ethan without Max, and no Max without Ethan. No matter what storms came, no matter what was waiting just around the bend, they would face it together. The house was unusually quiet. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a bowl of cereal, staring into it as if it could provide answers to questions he hadn't even formulated. He wasn't hungry. Not really. The milk had already started to congeal at the bottom, but he didn't care. His mind wasn't on the breakfast in front of him. No, his mind was on the sounds that would come, The heavy footsteps, the sharp words, the shouting. It was always the same. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each passing second a reminder of the storm that always followed Jacob Carter's return. Tick, tick. Each tick brought them closer to whatever it was that would happen next. Ethan tried to focus on the cereal, tried to drown out the anxiety rising in his chest. He couldn't even remember when it had started to feel this way, when each moment in this house felt like a countdown to something he couldn't avoid, something he didn't understand but was forced to endure. He could hear his mother in the other room, her voice barely audible as she spoke to someone on the phone. It was a soft, careful tone, one that reminded him of how she used to be before everything began to change, back when he had still been a little boy who believed things would always stay the same, safe and predictable. But not anymore. A sound from the front door made his heart leap, the heavy bang of boots hitting the floor, the familiar squeak of the door as it was forced open, the unmistakable sign that his father was home. Ethan's body tensed, instinctively preparing for the chaos that was sure to follow. His hands clenched around the edge of his bowl, his knuckles whitening, but he didn't move. He couldn't. In the background, Max, who had been lying quietly at his feet, lifted his head and stood, sensing the tension. Ethan barely noticed, too, caught up in the rising anxiety in his own chest. Then came the voice, loud, sharp, and full of fury. "Sarah!" Jacob's voice echoed through the house, and even Max stiffened, his body tensing beside Ethan's chair. The boy's throat tightened, but he didn't respond. He never did. From the other room, he could hear his mother's voice, soft, calm, but tinged with something Ethan couldn't quite identify. "Jake, we've been through this." The argument had already begun. Ethan slowly stood up, leaving his unfinished cereal on the table, and made his way toward the living room. The muffled voices were growing louder. His footsteps were almost silent as he walked through the hallway and into the dimly lit living room, where the familiar scene was unfolding. Jacob Carter, tall and broad-shouldered, stood in the center of the room, his face flushed with anger, his hands curled into fists at his sides. His eyes, dark and bloodshot from alcohol, locked onto Sarah with an intensity that Ethan had grown accustomed to. Sarah stood a few feet away, her posture rigid, but her eyes flickered nervously as she glanced toward the door, as though contemplating escape. The storm was inevitable. Ethan knew this. "I'm not doing this anymore, Sarah." Jacob's voice was low but laced with venom. "You think you can keep this family together pretending everything's fine? You think this is just some little disagreement? You've got another thing coming." Ethan felt the cold weight of the words sink into his chest. He had heard them before many times, but they never hurt any less. He felt small, like the room was shrinking around him, pushing him into a corner, where the walls seemed to close in. Max, sensing the tension, padded up to Ethan's side, nudging his hand with his warm snout. The dog's presence was quiet but powerful, an anchor in the storm. Ethan's fingers found Max's soft fur, and for a moment he let the comfort of it steady him, as if Max could somehow hold the world together for him. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steady, despite the storm brewing in front of her. "Jake, we've talked about this, over and over again." It was like a slap to the chest, a blow that knocked the wind out of him. "He's just a boy, Jake." Sarah's voice cracked slightly, but she held her ground. "He's not you." Jacob stepped closer, his face now inches from hers. The tension in the room grew so thick that it felt suffocating. "Then maybe you should start acting like it, Sarah. Maybe you should start teaching him that life isn't always a fairy tale, that sometimes people don't get happy endings." Ethan didn't know where to look. He couldn't bear to see the pain in his mother's eyes, or the twisted expression on his father's face. He couldn't even find the words to make this stop. The anger, the harsh words, they filled the room like smoke, suffocating everything they touched. Max, however, didn't back down. He moved closer to Ethan, his golden fur brushing against the boy's leg. He sat at Ethan's feet, looking up at him with steady eyes, as though silently saying, "I'm here. I'm with you." The dog's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the whirlwind around them. Jacob turned suddenly, his gaze shifting to Ethan, who had retreated a few steps, trying to make himself invisible, trying to hide from the chaos. "You see, Ethan," Jacob said, his voice colder now, "this is all your fault. You've been feeding her this nonsense. You've been letting her believe that she can protect you from the real world, that you're somehow different. But you're not. You're just like me." Ethan wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to defend himself. But his throat felt dry, his voice stuck somewhere deep inside him. Max, sensing his distress, padded forward and sat beside Ethan, his body leaning against the boy's leg for support. Jacob didn't seem to notice the dog, or if he did, he didn't care. Instead, he glared down at Ethan, his words dripping with disdain. "You're weak, Ethan. Just like her. Weak." Tears burned at the back of Ethan's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Instead, he bit his lip and looked away, focusing on Max. The dog nudged him again, his tail wagging once. A small, quiet gesture of comfort. It was the same message that had always been there. "I'm here and I won't leave." Sarah stepped forward now, standing between Ethan and Jacob. "Jake, enough." Her voice was steady but filled with pain. "I won't let you do this, not anymore." Jacob sneered. "You're just gonna let him grow up soft? You're gonna let him live in this fantasy world? He's gonna get a harsh dose of reality, and it's going to break him, Sarah." But Sarah didn't back down. She looked Jacob in the eye, her expression hardening. "I'd rather him grow up with love than grow up thinking he has to be like you." Ethan watched the two of them, the tension between them so thick it was almost tangible. But through it all, Max stayed beside him, never wavering. His eyes were fixed on Jacob, calm and unwavering, as if daring anyone to break his quiet, unspoken promise to Ethan. Jacob seemed to notice the dog then, his gaze flicking to Max before turning back to Sarah with a sneer. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath. But Sarah's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You need to leave, Jake. Now, I'm done." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't move. He couldn't look away from the tense standoff unfolding in front of him. Finally, Jacob scoffed and turned away, stalking toward the door. "Fine. Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when he turns out just like me." Ethan's chest tightened, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him like a physical force. But just as quickly as the storm had arrived, it passed, and the door slammed shut behind Jacob, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his hands trembling. The room felt too quiet, the air too still. Then Max nudged him again, a soft, insistent push against his leg. Ethan looked down at the dog, and for the first time all day, he felt like he could breathe. Max's eyes were calm, full of understanding, and as Ethan reached down to ruffle the dog's ears, he felt the weight in his chest start to ease, just a little. Max had always been there, through every storm, through every moment of darkness. Ethan knelt down, wrapping his arms around Max's neck, burying his face in the soft, warm fur. The dog's comforting presence felt like the only thing that was real in a world that had become so chaotic. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Max simply nuzzled his face, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. And in that moment, with the weight of the world pressing down, Ethan knew he would never be alone. No matter what came next, Max would be there. And that in itself was enough. The days after the confrontation with Ethan's father felt heavier somehow, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for the next storm to arrive. Ethan moved through it like a ghost, attending classes online, picking at meals his mother left out for him, doing his best to exist quietly. But Max was a constant, a living, breathing reminder that unconditional love was real. They developed a rhythm. Early morning walks before the sun stretched its golden fingers over the town, afternoons lying under the oak tree in the backyard, evenings spent curled up together while Ethan half-heartedly flipped through television channels. Max had a way of sensing Ethan's moods better than any human could. When sadness wrapped around Ethan like a heavy blanket, Max would rest his chin on Ethan's knee, grounding him. When anxiety crept up like static under his skin, Max would nudge him toward the door until they both stood outside, breathing in the crisp air. Ethan began to heal in small, quiet ways, and Max was always at the center of it. It was a chilly Saturday morning when it happened. The kind of day where the clouds hung low and heavy, and the air smelled faintly of rain yet to come. Ethan tugged on his favorite gray hoodie, the one 2 sizes too big, slipped Max's leash on, and decided they would explore the trails by the river. The river had always been a place Ethan went to think, winding paths, rushing water, the occasional heron picking its way through the reeds. It was peaceful. It was safe. Or so he thought. They reached the riverbank just as a light drizzle began to fall, speckling the dirt path with dark spots. Ethan smiled as Max trotted ahead, tail wagging, occasionally stopping to sniff at an interesting bush or investigate a suspicious-looking rock. Watching Max, Ethan felt lighter than he had in weeks. They wandered further along the trail, away from the more crowded areas. The trees grew denser here, arching overhead to form a cathedral of green and gold. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets, listening to the soothing rush of the river, the gentle patter of rain through leaves. He didn't notice the truck right away. Maybe it was because the trail was supposed to be closed to vehicles, or maybe it was because he had been so lost in thought. But the first he realized something was wrong was the rumble underfoot, a low, mechanical growl that didn't belong. Ethan turned his head, frowning, and then he saw it. A red pickup truck, barreling down the narrow trail, tires kicking up mud, the driver's face obscured behind a windshield smeared with rain. It was coming too fast, far too fast for this narrow, twisting path. "Max, come!" Ethan shouted instinctively, fear lancing through him. But Max was already moving, ears pricking at the sound, body tensing. He dashed toward Ethan, closing the distance in an instant. The truck wasn't slowing down. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He stumbled backward, slipping in the slick mud, his sneakers skidding uselessly. Max reached him just as Ethan lost his balance completely. For one awful suspended moment, Ethan felt weightless, teetering on the edge of the embankment, the river roaring below, swollen and fast from recent rains. And then everything happened at once. The truck's tires screeched. Ethan's foot found only empty air. The world tilted crazily. Max lunged. The dog's teeth clamped down on the sleeve of Ethan's hoodie, yanking him backward with a force Ethan wouldn't have thought possible. His body crashed into solid ground just as the truck careened past, missing them by inches. Mud and water sprayed in its wake. The driver barely even slowed. Max didn't let go. He kept pulling, dragging Ethan away from the edge, deeper into the safety of the trees. When they finally stopped, Ethan collapsed onto his hands and knees, gasping, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would tear through his chest. Max stood over him protectively, growling low in his throat, his body tense, every muscle vibrating with adrenaline. For a few terrible seconds, neither of them moved. Then Ethan, shaking, reached for Max, burying his hands in the dog's soaked fur. "You saved me," he whispered, voice broken and raw. Tears blurred his vision. "Max, you saved my life." Max whined softly, licking Ethan's face, his tail giving a small, hesitant wag, as if to say, "Of course, I'd do it 1,000 times over." Ethan clutched him tighter. He didn't even realize he was sobbing until the sound tore from his throat, ugly, desperate, full of all the fear he hadn't been able to express. Max simply let him, pressing closer, anchoring him. Minutes, or maybe hours, later, Ethan finally pulled away, wiping at his face. His hoodie was torn where Max had grabbed him, but he didn't care. He looked at Max, really looked at him, and saw more than a pet. He saw his protector, his best friend, his family, a bond forged not just in love, but in survival. They eventually made their way back toward the trailhead, Ethan keeping one hand firmly on Max's back the entire time. His legs felt unsteady, as if the earth itself couldn't be trusted. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. At the entrance to the trail, Ethan spotted a couple of hikers who had gathered, murmuring anxiously about the truck. Someone had already called the police. The truck apparently had been reported stolen earlier that morning. No one knew who the driver was or why he had been speeding through the trails, but that hardly mattered now. What mattered was that Max had been there. That night, after a long, scalding shower and a dinner he barely tasted, Ethan sat cross-legged on his bed, Max curled up beside him. The house was quiet. His mother at work, the walls humming with the kind of stillness that used to make Ethan feel alone, but not anymore. He ran his fingers through Max's fur, marveling at the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. "You're not just a dog," Ethan said softly. You're everything." Max blinked up at him, dark eyes shining with a trust so absolute it stole Ethan's breath. Somewhere deep inside him, something shifted. Something that had been cracked and fragile for so long, it had begun to seem normal. It was as if Max's loyalty, his fierce, wordless love, had reached into the broken parts of Ethan and begun stitching them back together. Slowly, carefully, one heartbeat at a time. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself replaying the near accident in his mind over and over again. The screech of tires, the feeling of falling, the sudden snap as Max had yanked him to safety. It haunted his dreams, showed up unbidden when he least expected it, in the middle of math homework, or brushing his teeth, or tying his shoes. But always, the fear was tempered by gratitude. Max had saved him. That truth became a steady drumbeat in Ethan's chest, grounding him on the hardest days. At school, when classmates whispered about the weird kid who hardly talked. At home, when his father's absence left a hollow ache behind every door. At night, when the darkness seemed endless and the weight of his own doubts tried to smother him, Max was there. Max with his big, soulful eyes and unshakable presence. Max, who had risked everything without a second thought. Ethan wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And it was all because of Max. The years slipped by in ways both slow and sudden, like the changing of seasons you barely notice until the leaves have all fallen, or the snow lies thick on the ground. Ethan grew taller, his frame stretching out awkwardly at first before settling into something leaner, more sure. His face lost the softness of childhood, sharpening into the beginnings of adulthood, but his eyes, they stayed the same. Quiet, thoughtful, a little wounded, but kind. Max grew too. From a rambunctious pup to a proud, strong companion, his golden fur deepened into a richer shade, his movements more deliberate, yet still full of the playful energy that had first captured Ethan's heart at the shelter. He remained Ethan's shadow, his anchor, the steady beat beneath the chaos of growing up. And somewhere along the way, Ellie reappeared in Ethan's world. Not that she had ever been far, really. Their houses stood across the street from one another, separated only by a narrow road and the tangled web of everyday life. As kids, they had played together often, building forts out of sticks and blankets, daring each other to climb the tallest oak trees, trading secrets whispered over popsicles in the heat of summer. But as they grew older, those moments had become fewer. Life had gotten in the way. Ethan had retreated inward after his father's departure, throwing up invisible walls he didn't quite know how to dismantle. Ellie, bright and bold, had made new friends, filled her days with laughter and soccer practice and drama club meetings. Yet Max, ever perceptive, ever patient, seemed to sense something unspoken between them. Something unfinished. It started fittingly with Max. One afternoon in late spring, when the air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the hum of bees, Ethan sat slouched on the front steps of his house, earbuds dangling uselessly around his neck. His phone lay abandoned beside him. He watched Max roll lazily in the yard, paws waving at the sky, completely at peace. A sudden shout startled them both. "Max! No, that's not your yard." Ethan squinted across the street. There, in a flurry of wild red curls and frantic hand-waving, was Ellie, now 14, same as Ethan, chasing after a soccer ball that had rolled from her driveway straight onto Ethan's lawn. And Max, in typical Max fashion, had seized the opportunity for chaos. He leapt up, tail wagging furiously, snatched the ball in his mouth, and tore off in a wide circle around the yard. Ellie skidded to a halt at the curb, laughing breathlessly. "You menace." Ethan stood slowly, shoving his hands deep into his hoodie pocket. He felt awkward, unsure, balancing on the edge of wanting to say something and the heavier gravity of staying silent. It had been months since they'd spoken more than a passing hello. Max made the decision for him. With a triumphant bark, Max trotted over to Ethan, dropped the soccer ball at his feet, and looked up expectantly. "Well?" Ellie called. "You gonna help me or not?" Ethan hesitated, then picked up the ball. He gave it an experimental toss, gentle, underhanded. Max, misunderstanding entirely, leapt and batted the ball back toward Ellie with his nose, sending it rolling across the street. Ellie laughed again, a clear, bright sound that punched straight through the walls. Ethan had spent so long building around himself. She jogged back to retrieve it, then returned, bouncing the ball lightly on her knee. "You trained him to play soccer, or what?" Ethan shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He pretty much trained himself." Max, sensing victory, bounded back over to Ellie, nudging her hand insistently. "Hey boy," she said, dropping to her knees to scratch behind his ears. "You remember me?" "Huh." Max licked her face enthusiastically, tail thumping like a drum against the ground. Ethan watched them, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in his chest. Maybe things didn't have to be so lonely after all. That afternoon stretched into an hour, then two. Ellie stayed. They kicked the soccer ball back and forth across the street, laughing when Max inevitably intercepted it. They talked awkwardly at first, the way kids do when time has made strangers of old friends, but the words came easier as the minutes passed. Ethan learned that Ellie was trying out for the school's soccer team next year, that she had started playing guitar. "Dios Verif," she admitted with a grin, that she still loved thunderstorms and hated spinach and thought math was a personal attack. In return, he told her about the books he was reading, the songs he was trying and failing to learn on his second-hand keyboard, and how Max had once chased a squirrel into the neighbor's garage and gotten locked inside for an entire afternoon. They laughed until their sides ached. And Max, sprawled happily between them, seemed to smile too. The days that followed wove themselves into a new kind of pattern. Ethan and Ellie, and Max, always Max, became inseparable once again. They spent long summer afternoons at the riverbank, Max splashing after thrown sticks, while Ethan and Ellie skipped stones and argued about who was better. They built a rickety treehouse in the big oak behind Ethan's house, hammering crooked boards into place while Max supervised from below. They biked to the ice cream stand at the edge of town, racing down the sun-drenched streets, Max's tongue lolling out happily as he bounded alongside them. Somewhere along the way, Ethan noticed things about Ellie he hadn't before. The way her freckles darkened in the sun, scattering like constellations across her nose. The way her green eyes sparked when she was excited, like sunlight hitting leaves after a rainstorm. The way she laughed, loud and unself-conscious, and utterly unafraid. He noticed, too, the way his chest tightened sometimes when she smiled at him a certain way. And how Max always seemed to nudge them closer, a casual bump of his head against Ethan's hip, a gentle shove of his nose against Ellie's hand, as if he understood something Ethan didn't yet have the words for. Their bond deepened as they grew. At 16, when Ethan got his first real heartbreak, a brief, awkward relationship that ended in confusion and hurt, it was Ellie who sat beside him under the stars, passing him a carton of ice cream and pretending not to notice the tears he wiped away when he thought she wasn't looking. At 17, when Ellie's parents nearly divorced and her world cracked at the seams, it was Ethan who climbed through her bedroom window at midnight with Max in tow, offering silent comfort when words felt useless. Max was there for all of it. The whispered confessions, the late-night drives with music blaring and windows down. The clumsy, terrifying, wonderful realization that maybe, just maybe, they were falling in love. Ethan wasn't sure when exactly he fell for Ellie. Maybe it was the night she played him a terrible halting version of Hey There Delilah on her guitar, cheeks red with embarrassment. Maybe it was the afternoon she patched up Max's paw after he stepped on a shard of glass, whispering soft reassurances the whole time. Maybe it was the thousand little moments strung together like beads on a string, each one ordinary and extraordinary all at once. All he knew was that he loved her, and somehow, impossibly, miraculously, she loved him too. On a crisp autumn evening, with leaves swirling around their feet and the air smelling faintly of wood smoke, Ethan finally found the courage to tell her. They stood in the park, Max sitting patiently between them, his head cocked as if he understood the significance of the moment. Ethan shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, heart hammering so loudly he was sure she could hear it. "Ellie?" he said, voice rough. I think I've loved you for a really long time. I just didn't know it." Ellie's eyes widened slightly, freckles standing out stark against her pale skin. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, biting her lip, and then she smiled. The kind of smile that could shatter galaxies. "I know," she said simply. "Me too." Max barked once, sharp and joyful, breaking the spell. They both laughed, breathless, and without thinking, Ethan reached for her hand. She laced her fingers through his, without hesitation. It felt easy. It felt right. It felt like home. And standing there under the vast, indifferent sky, with Max pressing happily against their legs and the world spinning madly on around them, Ethan realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. He never really had been, because family wasn't just the people you were born to. Sometimes, if you were lucky, family was a red-haired girl with a heart too big for her chest, and a dog who had stitched all your broken pieces back together, one quiet, steadfast moment at a time. The days after Ethan's 16th birthday should have been filled with light, the thrill of growing older, the comfort of Max's unwavering presence, the quiet but growing closeness with Ellie. But life had its way of casting unexpected shadows, even on the brightest paths. It started subtly at first, small remarks from classmates. A shove in the hallway. Accidental, they said. Laughter that didn't stop when Ethan walked by. Laughter that felt sharp, heavy, personal. He tried to brush it off at first. He told himself it didn't matter. He had Max. He had Ellie. What more did he need? But cruelty, when persistent, can seep into even the strongest hearts. It was a Friday afternoon, the sun setting in a fiery sky, when it all came to a breaking point. Ethan walked out of the school's heavy doors, his backpack slung low on one shoulder. His face was set in a tight, controlled expression, the kind he had learned to wear when he didn't want the world to see the cracks. Max was waiting by the low fence, as he always did, his tail thumping excitedly against the ground. Seeing him, that flash of golden fur, that pure, unfiltered joy, made something inside Ethan loosen slightly, though he tried hard not to show it. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said quietly, crouching down to rub behind Max's ears. Max leaned into the touch, whimpering softly as if he could sense something was wrong. Before Ethan could say another word, a voice called out from behind him. "Hey, loser! Talking to your only friend again?" A group of 3 boys, Mark, Jason, and Chris, swaggered toward him, laughing. Max immediately went on alert, standing in front of Ethan, his body tense but not aggressive, protective. Ethan's heart pounded. He tried to stand up, to act like it didn't bother him. "Come on, man," Jason said, snickering. "No wonder nobody talks to you. Who brings a mutt to school every day?" "He's my service dog," Ethan muttered. Even though it wasn't technically true, Max wasn't certified, but he was his lifeline. "Aw," Mark mocked, pretending to wipe away a fake tear. "Poor little Ethan needs his whittle puppy to protect him." Chris reached out, trying to shove Ethan's backpack off his shoulder. Max barked, a sharp, commanding sound that made all three boys freeze for just a moment. "You better keep that freak on a leash," Jason snapped, stepping back. Ethan's face burned with humiliation. He pulled Max close, not trusting himself to speak. They finally moved off, laughing among themselves, throwing glances back over their shoulders. Ethan walked home stiffly, Max trotting at his side, glancing up at him every few steps. Once they turned onto the quieter streets leading to his house, Ethan couldn't hold it in anymore. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, dropped his backpack onto the ground, and crouched down, wrapping his arms around Max's neck. "I'm so tired of this, Max," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so tired." Max pressed his head against Ethan's chest, letting out a low, comforting whine. Tears he had held back all day finally broke free. He wasn't even sure what hurt more, the taunts or the fact that he was starting to believe them, that maybe he was broken, maybe he wasn't good enough, maybe he deserved to be alone. Max didn't move, didn't flinch. He stayed there, anchoring Ethan to something real, something that wasn't cruel or judgmental or cold. "I don't know what's wrong with me," Ethan whispered hoarsely. "I'm not like them. I can't laugh at people. I can't pretend I'm someone else." Max licked a tear from Ethan's cheek, tail thumping once against the sidewalk, soft, reassuring. It was as if Max was saying, "You don't have to be like them. You are enough." That night, after dinner, Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor of his bedroom, the light from his desk lamp casting long, warm shadows across the room. Max lay beside him, head resting on Ethan's knee. On Ethan's desk sat a stack of homework he couldn't bring himself to touch. In his chest sat a heaviness he couldn't explain. A soft knock came at the door. "Ethan," it was Ellie's voice. "Yeah?" he croaked, trying to sound normal. She pushed the door open slightly, peeking in with her green eyes wide behind her glasses. "I brought something," she said, holding up a plate with 2 giant chocolate chip cookies. Ethan managed a small, exhausted smile. Ellie came in, sitting cross-legged across from him, offering a cookie without a word. They ate in silence for a few moments, Max shifting to place his head in Ellie's lap as well, always needing to be touching both of them. "I saw them today," Ellie said quietly, after a long pause. Ethan stiffened. I didn't know if I should say anything. I didn't want to make it worse." Her voice trembled a little. "But I saw what they did." He shrugged, staring at the floor. "It's whatever." "It's not," she said fiercely, surprising him. "You don't deserve that." "None of it." Ethan didn't know what to say. "You're kind," she continued, voice shaking slightly. "You're smart. You actually care about people. And you have Max, who is basically the best judge of character in the universe." Max gave a soft, approving bark at that, making both of them laugh a little through the heavy air. I just feel like I'm always going to be the weird kid," Ethan muttered. Ellie reached over and poked his forehead gently. "You're not weird," she said. "You're just you, and that's better than pretending to be someone you're not." Ethan's throat tightened. Max shifted again, pressing his body against Ethan's side, warm and solid and real. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, Max curled up at his side, he thought about what Ellie had said. He thought about the way Max had barked at the bullies, unafraid. The way he had stayed, unwavering, when Ethan's own strength had cracked. Maybe he wasn't supposed to fit into the mold everyone else seemed to expect. Maybe that was okay. Max stirred beside him, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Ethan smiled into the darkness, reaching down to ruffle Max's ears. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me," he whispered. Max, even half asleep, thumped his tail once in agreement. The next week passed, like moving through molasses. Every morning, Ethan fought the growing knot in his stomach just to get out of bed. Max would nudge him awake, nuzzle him with a warm nose, and Ethan would smile weakly because for Max, he had to try. School was no easier. The bullies became bolder, sensing weakness the way wolves sensed wounded prey. They found small ways to make Ethan's life miserable. Papers knocked off his desk when teachers weren't looking, cruel notes stuffed into his locker, whispered insults just loud enough for him to hear. Max couldn't come inside the classrooms. Inside those walls, Ethan felt alone. It was Wednesday afternoon when everything broke open. Ethan sat at the edge of the empty soccer field, knees drawn up to his chest, staring blankly at the horizon. Practice had ended over an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to go home yet. The words he had overheard that day echoed in his mind. Why does he even bother coming here? He's never going to be anything. Freak. Max sat patiently beside him, close but not crowding, as if he knew Ethan needed space, but also needed not to be alone. The sky was painted in colors too beautiful for how ugly Ethan felt inside. Bruised purples, burning oranges, the last breath of a day dying into night. I don't get it, Max, Ethan said, voice hollow. I try to be good, I try to be better, and it never matters. Max leaned into him gently, resting his big head against Ethan's arm. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. I'm just tired of trying, he whispered. A soft sound reached him, not a bark, not a whine, but a deep, soulful rumble from Max's chest. It was the kind of sound that said, I hear you. I'm here. It broke something inside Ethan, and healed something too. He turned, burying his face into Max's thick golden fur, letting himself cry harder than he had in months, maybe years. Max stayed completely still, a fortress of comfort against the storm raging in Ethan's chest. When he finally pulled back, sniffling and exhausted, the sky had turned navy blue, stars beginning to poke through the darkness. Max licked his cheek once, solemnly, then nudged his pocket insistently. Ethan frowned, reaching into the pocket and finding a crumpled piece of notebook paper, something Ellie had slipped him earlier without him even noticing. He unfolded it. In Ellie's neat handwriting were 4 simple words. You matter. Always, Ethan. He stared at the words until they blurred into a watery mess. Max nosed him again, standing up, tail wagging once. It felt like Max was saying, see, not everyone is against you. Slowly, shakily, Ethan got to his feet. Max trotted ahead a few steps, turning to make sure Ethan was following. He was. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan chose to keep walking forward. The next morning, Ethan sat at the breakfast table, picking at his cereal. His mom, Rebecca, bustled around in the kitchen, humming tunelessly, not noticing the war raging inside her son. Max sat by the door, waiting. Ethan's backpack sat nearby, heavy with books and heavier with dread. He couldn't do it. He couldn't face another day like yesterday. His hands shook slightly as he pushed his cereal away. Max stood up, crossed the room, and placed one paw gently on Ethan's knee. It startled him enough to look up. Max stared at him, steady, calm, sure. We can do this, his eyes seemed to say. Together. Ethan took a breath, so deep it hurt. Okay, he whispered, for you. Max barked softly in approval. At school, Ethan kept his head down. He didn't trust himself to speak. Not yet. But when Mark accidentally bumped into him by the lockers, scattering his books, Ethan didn't crumple to the floor. He crouched down slowly, picking them up one by one. Max leaned against his side like a shield, calm and immovable. Mark sneered, but this time Ethan didn't look up, didn't engage, didn't give him the reaction he craved. Mark walked away, annoyed. And Ethan, heart pounding, realized something small but monumental. He had survived it. Maybe that was the first step. Later at lunch, Ethan sat outside under the old oak tree, the one that had been his hiding spot since elementary school. Max stretched out beside him, blinking contentedly at the sun. Ellie found them there, dropping onto the grass without asking permission because she never needed it. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Sometimes healing didn't come from speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it came from a warm shoulder leaning against yours, from a dog who refused to let you drown, from a friend who sat quietly with you until the tide of pain ebbed away. The gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them, making them whisper like old friends sharing secrets. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the late afternoon sun soak into his skin, feeling the slow, patient heartbeat of the earth beneath him. Max shifted closer, resting his massive head across Ethan's lap. The simple, steady weight of him was grounding, as if Max was anchoring Ethan to the Tefe moment, pulling him back every time his mind tried to drift into dark places. Ellie sat cross-legged nearby, doodling absently in the corner of her notebook. She glanced at Ethan sideways, pretending not to, giving him space to speak if he wanted, or to stay silent if he didn't. Ethan looked at them, his dog, his friend, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel entirely crushed by the loneliness. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. Maybe he never had been. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. Max was sprawled across the room, belly up, paws twitching slightly in sleep, as he dreamed of chasing rabbits or clouds or whatever filled a golden retriever's dreams. On the dresser sat a photo of Ethan as a little boy, 5 years old, clutching a stuffed animal, beaming at the camera. He hardly recognized that boy anymore. When had the world gotten so complicated? When had he started believing the worst things people said about him? Max snorted in his sleep, a sound so ridiculous that Ethan let out a breathy laugh. Maybe it wasn't about what other people said. Maybe it was about what he chose to believe. He lay back on his bed, Max's soft snoring filling the room like a lullaby, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan drifted into sleep without nightmares chasing him. The following Monday, something changed. It wasn't dramatic. No fists slammed onto desks, no triumphant speeches shouted in the cafeteria. It was quieter than that. It started when Ethan, carrying a tray in the lunchroom, saw Mark and his friends snickering in his direction. He felt the familiar coil of dread tighten in his chest. But then he spotted Ellie waving him over to a table by the window, and next to her Max sitting patiently, wearing his official therapy dog vest that allowed him into certain parts of the school. Max's tail thumped when he saw Ethan, and Ethan made a choice. He smiled, small but real, and walked straight past Mark without even a glance. He sat down next to Ellie and Max, and for the first time he laughed at something stupid Ellie said about the mystery meat on her tray. He didn't look back once. Over the next few weeks, little victories piled up like pebbles slowly building into a mountain. When Mark shoved him in the hallway, Ethan didn't shove back, but he also didn't flinch away. He stood his ground, looked Mark in the eye, and calmly said, "You done?" Mark blinked, thrown off by the lack of fear, and Ethan walked away, Max at his side. One afternoon, while working on a group project in English class, Ethan caught a couple of kids whispering and glancing at him. His old instincts screamed to retreat, to disappear. But then he remembered Max's steady gaze, Ellie's note in his pocket, his mom's worried but hopeful eyes when he left for school that morning. He raised his chin, took a breath, and asked the other students if they needed help understanding the assignment. They looked surprised, but nodded. And just like that, a bridge he thought had burned forever was rebuilt, plank by hesitant plank. Of course, not every day was perfect. Some days still sucked. Some mornings still felt like dragging himself through a swamp made of self-doubt. But every day he chose to try was another day he took back a piece of himself. Max was there for all of it. When Ethan crumpled on the kitchen floor after a bad day, Max curled up around him like a living blanket. When Ethan got an A on a test he thought he had failed, Max celebrated with wild, joyful spins around the living room. When Ethan sat staring out the window, wondering if things would ever truly get better, Max simply sat beside him. No demands, no expectations, and reminded him that love didn't have conditions. One evening, nearing the end of the school year, the town held its annual spring festival. Ethan wasn't going to go. Crowds made him nervous now. Too many people, too many chances for whispers and laughter and old wounds to be reopened. But Ellie practically dragged him by the arm, and Max, wearing a tiny blue bandana around his neck, looked so eager that Ethan couldn't say no. The festival buzzed with energy. Laughter, music, the scent of funnel cakes and popcorn. Children darted between booths, teenagers clustered in loud groups, adults sipped lemonade and talked about nothing and everything. Ethan hovered near the edge, at first Max's leash wrapped securely around his hand. Ellie flitted from booth to booth, grabbing his hand to pull him along, tossing bright, fearless smiles over her shoulder. Slowly, Ethan loosened up. He threw a beanbag at a target and won a stuffed bear for Ellie. He let Max lick a melting scoop of vanilla ice cream from his fingers. He even laughed, loud, free, when Max tried to chase a mechanical duck at one of the games. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in molten gold, Ellie dragged them toward the old wooden stage, set up in the town square. A local band started playing, rough around the edges but enthusiastic. Ellie danced barefoot in the grass, spinning wildly. She grabbed Ethan's hand and tried to pull him into the dance. He shook his head, embarrassed. But then Max gave a sharp bark, and with the whole town watching, Ethan let out a breathless laugh, bowed theatrically, and let Ellie pull him into the fray. They danced like fools. They danced like survivors. They danced like people who had finally realized they deserved to take up space in the world. Later that night, walking home under the stars, Ethan glanced down at Max. "Thank you," he said softly. Max didn't respond, not with words anyway. He just wagged his tail once and bumped his nose against Ethan's hand. It was enough. It was everything. The stars blanketed the sky in a soft shimmer as Ethan, Ellie, and Max meandered down the familiar winding road leading back to their neighborhood. The night's laughter still echoed in their ears, the lingering sweetness of cotton candy clinging faintly to their skin. Ellie hummed quietly to herself, arms wrapped around the stuffed bear Ethan had won for her, while Max trotted happily between them, occasionally brushing against Ethan's leg, his blue bandana flapping like a tiny flag of victory. Ethan inhaled deeply. The crisp scent of grass, earth, and night air filled his lungs. For once, everything felt okay, better than okay. It felt good. But then, a smell sharp and wrong sliced through the comfort like a knife. Burnt. Acrid. Smoke. Max stopped abruptly, his entire body rigid, ears perked. Ethan felt Max's tension vibrate through the leash. He frowned and glanced around, instincts prickling under his skin. "Do you smell that?" Ethan asked, his voice tightening. Ellie paused, lifting her nose to the breeze. The scent was faint, not the neighbor's usual backyard bonfire, thicker, heavier, something churning up old childhood warnings of danger. Max let out a low, warning growl, deep in his chest. They hurried forward, the quiet night swallowed by a new, creeping sense of urgency. As they rounded the bend, Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Smoke poured from the front windows of his house. Orange flickers of flame danced inside, ugly and alive. "Ethan," Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment he stood frozen, the world narrowing down to the surreal, nightmarish sight of his home being eaten from the inside out. And then Max barked, a sharp, commanding sound, snapping Ethan into motion. "My mom, Dad, they're inside," Ethan choked out, already sprinting toward the house, Max surging ahead of him. The heat hit them before they even reached the porch, a monstrous wall of fire-fed air that stole the breath from Ethan's lungs. He tried the front door, scalding hot to the touch. He recoiled instinctively. Max whined urgently, pawing at the door, then darted toward the side of the house. Without thinking, Ethan followed. Ellie, tears streaming down her face, called after him. "I'll call 911. Be careful." She fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling. Meanwhile, Max led Ethan to the side entrance. The door to the kitchen slightly ajar, smoke leaking out like a living thing. Max nosed it open with his snout, but didn't bolt inside. He turned and fixed Ethan with a look, almost a question. "Are you ready?" Ethan nodded, covering his mouth with his sleeve. Together they plunged into the smoke. Inside, chaos reigned. The kitchen was a battlefield. Broken glass, blackened walls, flames gnawing at the edges of cabinets. Ethan coughed violently, eyes watering. "Mom? Dad!" he shouted, voice hoarse. Somewhere upstairs, a faint thudding noise answered. Max barked sharply, once, then bolted toward the stairs. Ethan stumbled after him, heart hammering wildly. The staircase was already beginning to blister and crack under the heat, but Max bounded upward without hesitation. Ethan forced himself to follow, every step feeling like it might give way beneath him. Half-blind, coughing, he reached the landing. The smoke was thicker here, a heavy, choking blanket. Through the haze, he heard it, faint coughing, a woman's voice calling out weakly. "Mom!" Ethan screamed. Max lunged toward the master bedroom door, scratching furiously at it. Ethan pushed it open, and there, through the swirling smoke, he saw his parents. His mom, struggling to pull herself upright from where she had collapsed against the bed. His dad, barely conscious, slumped nearby. Max barked furiously, running between Ethan and his parents, as if urging him faster. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his mother's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Come on, we have to move," he yelled. Max moved to Ethan's father, tugging at his shirt collar with surprising strength. Together, boy and dog worked frantically to rouse him. Somehow, Ethan would never remember exactly how, they got both parents moving toward the stairs. The journey back down was worse. The flames had spread, greedy fingers licking up the walls, belching black smoke into the narrow hallway. Ethan's father sagged heavily between him and his mother, semi-conscious. Ethan's legs burned, muscles screaming under the weight. Max ran ahead a few feet, barking encouragement, then doubling back, nudging at Ethan's knees, refusing to let him falter. They reached the bottom. The floor was blisteringly hot now. Ellie's voice shouted from the front yard, desperate, terrified. "Over here! Ethan, over here!" Through the swirling smoke, Ethan saw the faint outline of the front door, slightly ajar now, probably forced open by neighbors or maybe just fire warping the frame. With a final staggering push, Ethan dragged his parents forward. Max stayed glued to his side, his golden coat darkened with soot, his eyes fierce. Together, they burst through the doorway and collapsed onto the lawn. Cool night air rushed over them. Ethan sucked in huge, ragged breaths, coughing so hard he thought he might break in half. Max circled him frantically, licking his face, pawing at him, making sure, checking that he was okay. Sirens wailed in the distance. Neighbors crowded the sidewalks, wide-eyed and murmuring. Ellie dropped to her knees beside Ethan, wrapping her arms around him, sobbing with relief. "They're okay," Ethan gasped, voice breaking. "They're okay." His mom and dad were alive, scorched, coughing, dazed, but alive. Because of Max, because Max had known, had understood, had acted when every second counted. Later, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot cocoa provided by paramedics, Ethan watched as firefighters battled the blaze. The house was a loss. That much was obvious. Walls buckled, windows shattered, roof partially collapsed. But the important things, the truly irreplaceable things, had been. He looked down at Max, who sat pressed against his side, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Ethan buried his face in Max's fur, breathing in the dog's familiar scent, smoke-tainted but still unmistakably Max. "You're my hero," Ethan whispered into his ear. Max leaned into him, letting out a soft, exhausted woof. Around them, the world carried on, flashing lights, shouting, the steady rush of water. But inside their little bubble, there was only gratitude, overwhelming and fierce. Max had saved them, not just from fire but from despair, from fear, from losing each other. He had saved their family in every way that mattered. As the night faded slowly into the first tentative light of dawn, Ethan made himself a promise. He would spend the rest of his life making sure Max knew how much he was loved. Because some debts could never truly be repaid, only honored, every single day. And loving Max was the easiest promise Ethan had ever made. The house next door stood quieter than usual. The brown curtains of Mr. Thompson's windows, once fluttering each morning when he watched the neighborhood begin its day, now hung still, heavy with absence. It had been 3 days since he passed. Ethan sat on the front porch steps, elbows on his knees, head bowed low. His hands were clasped together tightly, like if he let go he might unravel. Max rested his chin on Ethan's knee, big soulful eyes staring up, unmoving, sensing the weight around his boy. No, his young man now. The funeral had been simple, exactly as Mr. Thompson had wanted. A few close friends, neighbors, Ellie by Ethan's side, and Max sitting quietly among the mourners, his head bowed, as if he understood every word being spoken. Mr. Thompson had no immediate family left, and so when the small wooden casket had been lowered into the earth, it was Ethan who had stepped forward with trembling hands to place the first handful of soil onto it. Now, that weight sat in his chest like a stone, unmovable, heavy, painful. The autumn evening was curling around him, soft but cold. The first fallen leaves skittered down the sidewalk, brushing against the soles of Ethan's shoes. Forgotten. Max gave a small, concerned whimper, pressing his head harder into Ethan's leg. "I know, buddy," Ethan whispered hoarsely, reaching down to run his fingers through Max's thick, warm fur. His voice cracked on the words, the grief raw and unfiltered. He's gone." Max shifted, standing up slowly and pressing his weight against Ethan, insisting on being held, touched. Ethan wrapped his arms around Max's neck and buried his face into the dog's fur. The familiar scent of grass, earth, and the faint musky comfort of Max wrapped around him, a tether in the storm. He sobbed then, not the silent weeping he had managed at the funeral, not the stoic blankness he had worn around neighbors offering polite condolences, but the real grief, the kind only Max could witness. Messy, uncontrollable, full of heartache. Max didn't move. He stood solid as a rock while Ethan clung to him, his body shaking, his hands clutching at the dog like he was the only solid thing left in a world that felt like it was crumbling. Ethan remembered vividly the way Mr. Thompson had given him advice, sometimes gruffly, sometimes with a rare chuckle. The time he had helped Ethan fix his old bike, the hours they had sat on their adjoining porches, Mr. Thompson sipping tea and telling Ethan stories of his army days, of bravery, of fear, of love lost and friendships forged. All gone now, just memories. Ellie had come by earlier, a casserole in hand, because that's what her mother said people did when there was a loss. She had hugged Ethan tightly, eyes brimming with tears too, but she hadn't stayed long. Maybe she knew he needed to be alone. Or maybe she knew he needed to be alone with Max. "You're the only one who gets it, Max," Ethan whispered into the fur, voice muffled. "You're the only one who always knows what I'm feeling, even when I don't." Max shifted slightly, letting out a low, rumbling huff, not impatience but agreement, as if saying, "I'm here. I'll always be here." The sky above them faded from a pale pink to a dusky purple. The porch light flickered on automatically, bathing them both in a soft golden glow. Still, Ethan didn't move from his place, and Max didn't leave him. The night air grew colder, brushing against Ethan's damp cheeks, but he didn't shiver. Max's warmth was enough. Later, long after the world had darkened completely, Ethan finally shifted. He sat back, wiping at his face roughly, embarrassed despite knowing Max would never judge him. He looked down into those steady, amber eyes, and for a brief moment, it felt like Max was carrying his grief for him, not erasing it, but helping him hold it. "You remember how Mr. Thompson used to call you a fine soldier?" Ethan said, his voice rough but lighter somehow. He said, "You had more bravery in your tail than most men he fought with." Max's tail thumped once, a soft thud against the porch floorboards. A small smile broke through Ethan's grief. It hurt to smile, but it also healed a little too. "I think he meant it, you know," Ethan said, running a hand down Max's back. "You saved him, Max. And me. You saved a lot of people." Max leaned into the touch, his big body pressing against Ethan's side, steady and grounding. A protector. A friend. A piece of the heart Mr. Thompson had left behind. Ethan stood finally, legs stiff from sitting so long. Max stood with him, alert but calm. They walked down the steps together, the familiar rhythm of Max's paws clicking softly beside Ethan's worn sneakers. They crossed the short distance between Ethan's home and the small patch of earth in front of Mr. Thompson's porch. There, tucked neatly in the garden, was a stone Mr. Thompson had carved himself before the illness had made his hands too shaky, etched with the words, "What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others." Ethan knelt, brushing a few fallen leaves off the stone. He let out a shaky breath. "I miss you, Mr. Thompson," he said softly. Beside him, Max sat down and tilted his head upward, letting out a soft, mournful howl, low and aching and beautiful. The sound carried across the empty street, under the starlit sky, reaching for something unseen. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. Tears fell freely again, but they were different this time. Not just grief, but gratitude, too, for having known Mr. Thompson, for the stories shared, for the lessons learned, for Max, who now carried both their spirits in his loyal heart. That night, Ethan didn't sleep much. He sat by the window, Max curled up by his feet, watching the stars blink slowly against the dark velvet of the sky. "I'm gonna make you proud," Ethan whispered at the glass, voice trembling but certain. He looked down at Max, who lifted his head and wagged his tail once. "You and Mr. Thompson, both of you." Max blinked slowly, as if in agreement, before resting his head back down. Ethan leaned back in the chair, exhausted, heartbroken, but not alone. Never alone. Not with Max. Never with Max. Morning sunlight seeped in slowly through the curtains, a soft, warm glow. Ethan stirred awake in the chair, Max still at his feet. A new day had come. A new chapter was beginning. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan knew life would move forward. Scarred, changed, but stronger, woven together by the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. There was still so much ahead. Challenges, goodbyes, new hellos. But for now, there was Max, and Max was everything. The years folded over them like worn pages of an old book. Seasons changed, leaves fell, grew again, and through it all, Max remained, a steady heartbeat, at Ethan's side. Ethan had grown into his 20s, lean and wiry, with a look in his eye that spoke of having weathered more storms than most his age. He carried the weight of early responsibility, debts left behind after his mother's passing, an ailing house, and dreams that always seemed one paycheck out of reach. Yet, through it all, Max was there, growing older but never growing away. The job Ethan had worked so hard for, the one at the design firm in the city, had been everything he hoped for, until the layoffs came. Budget cuts, they said. Last hired, first fired. The drive home that night was a blur. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened, his chest hollow with fear. How would he make the mortgage payment? How would he pay for Max's medication now that arthritis was creeping into the old dog's joints? When he pulled into the driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically, and there was Max waiting at the door, ears perked, tail wagging in slow, deliberate thumps against the doorframe. He struggled to his feet, stiffness making him slower now, but his eyes were the same, warm, trusting, filled with that fierce, unwavering loyalty. Ethan sat in the car for a long time, forehead resting against the steering wheel, breathing through the panic that wanted to tear him apart. Max barked once, a soft, coaxing sound, like a friend tapping on your shoulder to remind you that you weren't alone. Finally, Ethan dragged himself out of the car. The moment he stepped onto the porch, Max pressed his head against Ethan's hip, sensing the storm swirling around his human. Ethan dropped to his knees right there, burying his face in Max's fur, the porch light humming gently above them.
"I don't know what to do, buddy," he whispered, voice cracking. Max let out a low, comforting rumble in response, licking the side of Ethan's face with slow, deliberate affection. They sat there for a long time, the night folding around them, until Ethan's breathing steadied. Inside the house, everything felt heavier, the bills on the kitchen table, the framed photographs of Ethan's parents.
The empty teacup Mr. Thompson had once left behind on the windowsill, untouched since. Ethan collapsed onto the worn couch, Max easing himself up beside him with a grunt. The dog's movements were slower these days, each step measured and careful, but his spirit was undimmed. Ethan turned his head, resting it against Max's shoulder. In the hush of the living room, with only the ticking of the old clock filling the space, Ethan allowed himself a moment to grieve, not just for the job lost, but for the life that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "I'm failing, Max," he said, barely above a whisper. His hand found Max's fur automatically, fingers weaving through the thick, familiar warmth. "I'm trying so hard, and it's not enough." Max shifted slightly, resting his chin heavily on Ethan's thigh. It was a simple gesture, but it anchored Ethan back to the ground. "You are enough," the gesture said. "You are not alone." Days stretched into weeks. Ethan applied for every job he could find, retail, warehouse work, anything. The savings dwindled rapidly. Some nights the fridge was nearly empty, but Max's food was never skipped, even if Ethan went without. He'd sit on the floor with Max, sharing pieces of peanut butter sandwiches when there was nothing else. The hardest night came one rainy Thursday. Ethan came home to a yellow notice on the door, warning of impending foreclosure if payments weren't caught up. The rain soaked him through before he even unlocked the door. Inside, he dropped the letter on the table, face blank, body numb. Max limped over, joints aching from the cold, and leaned heavily against Ethan's legs. Ethan crumpled to the floor, pulling Max into a tight embrace. "This house, I'm gonna lose it, Max," he choked out. "Everything Mom and Dad worked for, everything I promised them I'd hold on to." Max whined softly, licking the tears that streamed freely down Ethan's face. It wasn't about the wood and nails, it was the memories stitched into every corner. The birthdays, the Christmases, the late nights studying at the kitchen table, the lazy Sunday mornings with Max sprawled out in a patch of sunlight. Losing the house felt like losing his whole past. Ethan pressed his forehead against Max's, his body shaking with silent sobs. For a long time they simply sat there on the cold floor, two souls trying desperately to hold each other together. One evening, Ellie stopped by. She was back in town, fresh from her second year at college. Hair longer now, freckles faded, but still visible under the tired worry etched into her features. She brought groceries, simple things, bread, eggs, peanut butter, and sat quietly with Ethan and Max at the kitchen table. Ethan didn't have to say much. The weight on his shoulders spoke for itself. "You're not alone, you know," Ellie said gently, her hand covering Ethan's for a moment. "You've got me. You've got Max." Ethan managed a small, grateful smile, squeezing her hand back. But when the door closed behind her later that night, and it was just Ethan and Max again, the despair crept back in like a cold wind. Ethan sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, Max's heavy head resting across his lap. The warmth of Max's body was a steady presence, like a heartbeat in the dark. He ran his fingers absently through Max's graying fur. The years had softened the dog's muzzle to silver, and his eyes, though still bright, held a deeper wisdom now, as if he had seen all of Ethan's battles and carried a share of them himself. "You're the only reason I'm still standing, old man," Ethan said quietly. Max let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing under Ethan's touch. It was true. When the nights grew too dark and the future too uncertain, It was Max's unwavering presence that anchored Ethan, reminding him that hope wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a heavy head on your lap, and the knowledge that no matter how far you fell, someone would still be there to catch you. In the days that followed, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't save the house, the numbers didn't lie, but he could save the spirit of it, the memories, the love, the home they had built together. He sold what he could: furniture, tools, things that could be replaced someday. With Ellie's help, he found a small apartment on the other side of town. Tiny, barely 2 rooms, but it allowed dogs. And that was all Ethan needed. The night before the movers came, Ethan sat on the porch steps one last time, Max beside him. The house stood silent around them, packed up and hollowed out, but it didn't feel empty. Not with Max there. Ethan ran a hand through Max's fur, breathing in the cool night air heavy with the scent of rain and old wood. "We're gonna be okay, Max," Ethan said, voice steady now. He believed it because when he looked down at Max, he saw not just a dog, but a lifetime of loyalty and love staring back at him. "We're gonna start over, together." Max thumped his tail against the porch floor, slow and sure. Together. Always together. The new apartment was small, no creaky porch swing, no sprawling backyard. But it was enough. For Ethan and Max, it was home. They made it home. Max found his place quickly. A sunlit corner by the living room window where the warm afternoon light painted his fur golden. Ethan bought an old rug from a second-hand shop and laid it there, just for him. It wasn't much, but Max loved it. At first, Ethan convinced himself that Max was just a little stiff from the move, a little tired from the excitement. But soon, the signs became harder to ignore. Max struggled more getting to his feet. The spring in his step was gone, replaced by careful, deliberate movements. When they went for walks, Ethan shortened the distance without saying anything, pretending he was just tired himself. Sometimes Max would stumble. Other times he'd pause mid-step, breathing harder than usual, tail wagging weakly as if to apologize for slowing down. Ethan laughed it off at first. He ruffled Max's fur, called him old man, and told him they both deserved to take things easy now. But late at night, when the apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the heater, Ethan would watch Max sleeping. The way his legs twitched as he dreamed, the soft wheezes in his breathing, and feel a quiet dread grow heavy in his chest. Max was getting old, and this time, no amount of hope or stubborn love could turn back the clock. It was one morning, crisp and blue sky, when the truth hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had just finished breakfast, pouring coffee into his chipped mug, when he heard a strange sound, a low whine, almost a whimper. He rushed to the living room. Max was sprawled awkwardly on the rug, legs trembling, unable to stand. He looked up at Ethan with wide, apologetic eyes, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, frozen. Then he dropped to his knees. Hey, buddy. It's okay," he whispered, voice trembling. He slid his arms under Max's body and gently lifted him. Max was heavier than he remembered, or maybe Ethan was just weaker. He carried Max to the couch and laid him down carefully. Max pressed his nose into Ethan's hand, breathing hard but calming under his touch. Ethan didn't realize he was crying until he tasted salt on his lips. The vet's office smelled like antiseptic and sadness. Ethan sat in the sterile room, Max leaning heavily against his leg, eyes half closed. Dr. Ramirez, a kind woman with graying hair and a gentle touch, spoke in the soft, careful voice of someone delivering bad news to someone who didn't deserve it. Arthritis, congestive heart failure starting. Maybe a few months, maybe a year if they were lucky. Pain management. Gentle care, quality of life is what matters now, she said kindly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan nodded numbly, staring down at Max, who licked his hand slowly, as if to say it was okay. On the drive home, Ethan didn't play the radio. He just talked to Max, told him stories, reminded him of the days at the shelter, the muddy riverbanks they used to explore, the long summer evenings with Ellie laughing in the distance. Max listened, his head resting on Ethan's thigh, his brown eyes shining with trust and love. They adapted. Ethan moved his mattress onto the floor so Max could sleep beside him without struggling. He rearranged the apartment so there were no stairs or obstacles in Max's path. He bought soft foods, special supplements, anything that could ease Max's days. Every evening, they sat together by the window, watching the sun bleed gold and crimson across the sky. Ethan talked. Max listened. The bond between them deepened in those quiet days, thick as blood, unbreakable. Max had been Ethan's protector once, shielding him from loneliness, from fear, from heartbreak. Now, it was Ethan's turn. He became Max's legs when they needed to go goat, carrying him down the steps without a word. He became Max's voice when he whimpered, guessing at what he needed: water, warmth, reassurance. He became Max's world, just as Max had once been his. One night, after a long walk, Max nestled in a wagon Ethan had rigged so he could still feel the breeze. They returned home, and Ethan noticed Max's breathing was more labored than usual. He lay beside Max on the rug, pressing his forehead against the old dog's. "You're tired, huh, buddy?" he whispered. Max licked Ethan's nose weakly, his tail brushing the floor once, then falling still. Ethan stayed there, stroking Max's fur, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep, that everything would be okay, that he'd be okay, that Max could rest if he needed to. The stars spun slowly outside the window. Ethan felt Max's heartbeat faint and steady under his hand. He knew, deep down, that the time was drawing near. But not tonight. Tonight, they had each other. Tonight, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Ethan called in sick more often. He spent his days at home, refusing to waste a single moment. They sat in the park, under the old oak trees. They napped together in patches of sunlight. They watched the rain streak down the windows, sharing silent, endless conversations without a single word spoken. Sometimes Ellie would visit, sitting cross-legged on the floor, feeding Max pieces of apple and scratching behind his ears. "He's had a good life," she would say softly, blinking back tears she tried to hide. Ethan would nod, but in his heart, the very idea of a world without Max seemed unbearable. He didn't know how to be Ethan without Max. Max had been there through every version of him, the lonely boy, the struggling teenager, the heartbroken adult. Max was his history, his present, his anchor. One morning, Max didn't get up when Ethan called him for breakfast. He just lay there breathing slowly, eyes half-lidded but aware. Ethan sat beside him, offering a piece of peanut butter toast. Max sniffed it politely but didn't eat. Instead, he leaned into Ethan's chest, a long, shuddering sigh escaping his body. Ethan wrapped his arms around him, holding him close. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, tears spilling freely now. "It's okay, I'm here, I'm right here." Max let out a soft whine, the same sound he had made when Ethan first brought him home from the shelter so many years ago. The circle was closing. As the sun climbed higher, filling the room with golden light, Ethan lay with Max on the floor, their breathing sinking slowly. He told Max about the first time they met, how he had chosen him over all the other pups, how Max had saved him 1,000 different ways, how grateful he was. "You were my best decision," Ethan said, voice cracking. "The best thing that ever happened to me." Max's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing soft and shallow. Ethan pressed his forehead against Max's one last time, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, the heartbeat slowing but still there, still fighting, still loving, and in that sacred suspended moment, heart breaking, spirit overflowing with love, Ethan whispered the only words that mattered. "Thank you, Max. I love you. I'll always love you." Max's tail gave one final, gentle thump against the floor, and then he was still. The house felt different now. Too still. Too quiet. Ethan sat on the edge of Max's old bed, fingers loosely tangled around the worn collar he had removed just hours ago. The weight of it felt unbearable in his hand, as if it carried the entirety of their years together. The laughter, the tears, the victories, and the crushing silences. Max was gone. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, thick and golden, speckling the wooden floor where Max once loved to nap. The scent of old leather and lavender still lingered faintly, clinging to the air as if refusing to let go just yet. Just like Ethan, he tightened his grip around the collar and bowed his head, forehead pressing into his knuckles, the hot prickle of tears spilling freely now. He made no sound. There were no sobs or cries, just a silent storm of grief that shook his whole body, deep and aching. There was no rush to move, no one telling him it was time to get up. Time had simply stopped. The days that followed blurred together. Ethan moved through them like a ghost. Ellie checked in often, bringing casseroles and warm words, but Ethan could barely meet her eyes. He knew she understood. More than anyone, she understood, but grief was a strange and lonely thing. It folded him inward, trapping him inside memories that he both clung to and ran from. He still heard Max sometimes, the faint jingle of his tags, the soft huff of a sigh beside the couch, the tap of nails against the kitchen floor. Phantom sounds, echoes. Sometimes he found himself reaching down absently while reading, fingers searching for the comforting fur that wasn't there anymore. It was a loneliness deeper than he had ever known. One evening, about a week later, Ethan found himself standing at the old oak tree at the back of the property. It was Max's favorite spot. Here, they had spent countless afternoons, Max chasing leaves, barking at squirrels, flopping onto his back for belly rubs. The setting sun painted the sky in fierce streaks of orange and pink, a beauty that felt almost cruel now. Ethan knelt at the base of the tree, a small wooden box tucked under his arm. Inside were Max's favorite things, a frayed tennis ball, the bandana Ellie had stitched for him, a photo of the two of them when Max was just a clumsy pup, and a letter Ethan had written, though he hadn't dared to read it again. He dug a small hole with his hands, the dirt cool and damp, clinging under his nails. Each handful of soil felt like a surrender, each handful a goodbye. When the hole was ready, Ethan placed the box inside, whispering words he couldn't quite hear himself saying, things like thank you, and I'm sorry, and I love you. He covered the X gently, patting the earth flat with trembling hands, and then he just sat there, leaning against the old oak, as night crept in around him. The stars blinked awake one by one, silent witnesses to his mourning. In the weeks that followed, Ethan started to change. Slowly, gently, he returned to the routines Max had once demanded, the morning walks, even if alone, the trips to the park, the sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee at dawn. He couldn't bear to not do them. It felt like betraying Max's memory, and somewhere in those quiet routines, healing began to stitch itself into the raw wounds of his heart. One afternoon, Ethan visited the animal shelter where he had first found Max all those years ago. He didn't know why. He wasn't ready to adopt again. Maybe he just needed to be near that place, that sacred space where love had first found him. The shelter hadn't changed much. Same peeling blue door. Same clattering sounds of excited paws behind metal gates. A volunteer greeted him warmly, and when he mentioned Max, her face softened into something almost reverent. He was one of the good ones, she said, placing a hand over her heart. Ethan simply nodded, throat too thick to reply. As he wandered through the aisles, past eager noses and wagging tails, he smiled sadly. So much hope in these creatures, so much desperate, unconditional love, just waiting to be given. At the end of the row, a small black and white pup pressed itself against the cage door, tail thumping wildly. It was too soon, Ethan told himself. Far, far too soon. Still, he knelt down, and for a long, quiet moment, he just let himself feel it. The hope, the ache, the raw and trembling beauty of being open again. Later that night, Ethan sat in his study, Max's photo framed proudly on the desk. A candle burned beside it, the flame small but steady. He opened his laptop and pulled up a blank document. His fingers hovered over the keys for a long time before he began to type. Max's Fund. In honor of loyalty, courage, and love. It would be a non-profit, a fund to help elderly dogs find homes, to cover medical expenses for families struggling, to train therapy dogs for veterans. It was the best way Ethan could think to honor the life that had saved his own so many times. As he typed out the mission statement, a peace settled over him. He could almost feel Max lying at his feet, tail thumping lazily, letting out one of those contented sighs Ethan loved so much. The seasons turned. The oak tree blossomed in spring, heavy with new life. The house, once filled with hollow silences, now rang with new laughter, Ellie visiting often, neighbors dropping by to volunteer with Max's Fund, and sometimes just Ethan himself telling old stories about the dog who had taught him everything. The grief never left completely. It softened, though, worn smooth like river stones under the current of time, and every now and then, when Ethan closed his eyes and listened very carefully, he swore he could hear it. A bark, faint and joyous, carried on the wind. A reminder that love like theirs never really ends. It simply changes shape, moves quietly into the spaces between heartbeats, and lives there forever. Years had passed since that quiet evening under the old oak tree. The world had spun on, relentless in its motion, but Ethan's heart carried something permanent now, something precious. Max's memory. In the small corner of the world Ethan had built for himself, he had found peace. The pain of loss, while still present, no longer haunted him with the same sharpness. Instead, it had become a part of the landscape of his life, softened over time, worn smooth by the gentle passing of seasons. The house, once filled with the silence that followed Max's absence, was now full of purpose and love once more. The foundation of Max's Fund had flourished into something more than just a name. It had become a haven for countless dogs in need, giving them a second chance at the kind of love Max had given Ethan. Ethan had found new ways to remember Max. Every Sunday morning he would sit by the oak tree, a quiet tradition he had kept, and watch the seasons turn. It was here, in these moments, that he could almost feel Max beside him again. The sun, the breeze, the sound of leaves rustling. It all felt like a message, like Max's way of telling him, "It's okay. We're okay." Max's legacy was not just in the work Ethan had built in his honor, but in the quiet, profound ways he had changed Ethan's life forever. In the moments when Ethan needed guidance, it was Max's spirit that seemed to whisper the answers. In the moments when life felt too hard to bear, it was Max's memory that steadied him, reminding him of the resilience only love could foster. Though Max was no longer physically by his side, Ethan knew his heart was forever tethered to the brave dog who had stood by him in every storm. As the evening sky turned gold, Ethan stood outside his home, looking at the horizon where the sun dipped beneath the earth, taking its fiery glow with it. And as he stood there, feeling the weight of everything Max had given him, he truly felt that Max was still with him. Always. Max had never left. Not really. He had simply found another way to be near. And so the love they shared lived on, in the stories Ethan told, in the work he did, and in the space between heartbeats. If you've been touched by the journey of Ethan and Max, if their bond resonates with you, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue to share stories of love, loss, and healing. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. We hope that Max's legacy will inspire you to cherish those you love, give generously, and hold tight to the moments that matter most.